So welcome to our emergency webinar on the war between Israel and Hamas. This is obviously happening on a very fast track at a very dark and disturbing time. But I appreciate the Nazarian Center suggesting that we do this event, and I'm glad to be able to have two really knowledgeable experts on to talk about what has happened, but most importantly, why and what we might anticipate going forward. How things may unfold. Of course, very, very difficult set of questions, but trying to get some understanding, some context, some reflection on what is going on in these very dark times. So our two panelists today, Dalia Dassa Kaye, one of my senior fellows at the Burkle Center, longtime Middle East expert, formerly director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy at RAND, and currently running our initiative on regional security architecture, which is quite relevant for today's discussion. Waxman, of course, is the director of the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. He's also the Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA, and most pertinently, the author of The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know, a book that came out a few years ago. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to begin with the more particular, the more immediate, sort of what has happened and what might happen in the coming days, with some sort of issues of kind of political strategy and implications. And then we're going to move outward a little more to some of the regional implications, some of the other players, potential players, of course, the United States, but Iran, Russia, there are many other states, Saudi Arabia, with strong interests and potentially strong roles in what has unfolded and what will unfold. So we're going to begin with Dov first to talk a bit about the current situation, move to Dalia, but this is an interactive discussion amongst the three of us, though I'm not going to say much once I stop this opening monologue, and really let the two of them explain. I'm here to learn myself, and I really look forward to the discussion. We will have time for questions. So I please urge you, I know we have a very big audience, really astonishing number of people on this webinar. So please send your questions in through the Q&A feature, and we will compile those, and I will pose those to Dov and Dalia when we get to the back end of this discussion. So with that all in mind, Dov, if you could just begin with, I think we're all familiar with the broad contours of what's occurred, but just your assessment of how you see this in the context of what's really been a century of conflict between Arabs and Jews in the region. This is the latest version of that, but it's a very different version of that. And so I think you can probably give us some good context on that.
Thank you, Kal, and thank you for organizing this with us. It's really important at this time that we're trying to provide as much education and expertise as we can. So I think it's very important. We're going to talk a lot about the war that's taking place and the potential ramifications of it and the developments. But we need to be clear about what triggered this war, what started this war. And what started this war was a terrorist attack that Hamas perpetrated on Saturday, although it actually lasted now for some days. While Hamas have carried out scores of terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians in the past, this was unlike anything we've ever seen before. This was by orders of magnitude different than anything that Hamas has ever carried out before, and indeed anything that Palestinians in general. This was in many ways the worst single attack that any Palestinian group has ever carried out against Israel. It really, October the 7th, I think, will go down as the darkest day in Israel's history. And I don't say that to exaggerate. I think that just, I say that to underline the scale of the tragedy of what's taken place. Indeed, it may even be regarded as the darkest day in Jewish history since the end of the Holocaust. Israel's never experienced anything like this before, not only in terms of the numbers of dead and wounded, which continue to rise as I speak. Last I heard, there was now, I think the estimate is 1,300 killed in that attack, which is much beyond anything that Israeli civilians have paid before in terms of terrorist attack. In fact, more Israelis were killed on that day than in any previous of Israel's wars, including the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was a very costly war. Even on the second day of that war, which was very devastating to Israeli soldiers, many more Israeli civilians were killed on Saturday. So I think it's it's been compared to kind of 9/11, and I think that is in some ways an apt comparison because of the scale of the casualties involved. In fact, if you will look at it in terms of the relative population, the numbers of Israeli civilians killed is by orders of magnitude multiples of 9/11 in terms of Israel's population. But it's also like 9/11 in the psychological impact that this attack is having, has had and is still having on Israel. The shock, the horror, the fear, the sense of humiliation, impotence, all of those feelings that many Americans experienced on 9/11, Israelis, I think, have experienced. And I think it's important to understand that psychological impact because that also helps us understand Israel's reaction to these attacks, which we're going to talk about some more. Just to underline what's so unprecedented about this, not only the scale of the attack, as I've said, in terms of the numbers killed, the number of militants of Hamas that were able to cross the border by land, by sea and air, well over 1,000. The sophistication of the attack, the fact that Hamas was obviously planning this maybe for even a year or more, and the fact that they were able to do so while eluding Israel's extensive intelligence capabilities really demonstrates a level of kind of technical skill that I think nobody expected from Hamas. Not to say they were regarded as amateurs, but certainly what they've demonstrated, the level of being able to carry out something like this, and I think this is worth underlining, the savagery of this attack, the sadistic violence, the brutality, the cruelty. And that's something that, as a long-time observer of Hamas, I'm not surprised by Hamas carrying out terrorist attacks, but I am surprised by the brutality of this and this kind of the sadistic violence, because it's much more reminiscent of the kind of violence carried out by groups like ISIS than Hamas in the past. So I think, this isn't just another Hamas terrorist attack. This is something very different, and it might indicate for those of us who have spent a lot of time studying Hamas that maybe we need to rethink our understanding of this organization and the assumptions that we've had about how it operates, what its goals are, what its interests are, because I think the old paradigm for understanding Hamas as an organization is really no longer relevant. We are going to probably talk more about the intelligence failures, the military failures on Israel's part. I also want to emphasize this was not just a massive intelligence failure. Certainly that was no doubt, I would say, Israel's worst intelligence failure, actually beyond even what occurred in 1973. Because there was really no advance warning. Actually, in 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, there were some warnings. They just weren't passed on to the political leadership. In this case, the whole intelligence establishment obviously missed this, and that's really shocking. It was a massive military failure in the inability to prevent this mass infiltration, and then the slowness of the IDF to respond to it, the fact that civilian communities were captured and held by Hamas militants for hours before the IDF was able to allocate troops and to fight back. And then that they were able to carry so many hostages back across the border into Gaza. On every level, it was a military debacle and an Israeli intelligence failure. But I also think we need to recognize that this was also a political and a strategic failure on the part of the Israeli government, and a strategic failure on the part for many of us, really, who provide intelligence analysis in understanding Hamas's motives. So I think it is a game changer. I think obviously it's going to dramatically change, it is dramatically changing Israel's policy and approach toward Hamas and the Gaza Strip. And I think it's also going to have major implications for the broader Israeli-Palestinian relationship. And as I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, it's also has the potential, at least, to have very major regional repercussions as well. But I think, first and foremost at this point, I just want to emphasize how, beyond the analysis that we're going to provide in today and in our webinar, I think it's first of all important to recognize that nothing about Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, though I'm very critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, nothing about the justice of the cause for Palestinian self-determination or freedom or anything like that, nothing can rationalize or justify or excuse what Hamas did. And I think everybody, no matter where you stand on this, intense and bitter conflict, can, and everybody should, I think, be very clear-eyed, as President Biden has been, in calling out in President Biden's words, that unspeakable evil, because I think that's what we have witnessed.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. Let's begin. There's a couple of things you brought up, both about the nature of this attack and the fact that it is unprecedented in many ways. And I, of course, completely agree. Killing civilians, deliberately targeting civilians is never acceptable and wasn't ever seen on this scale before. And so this is a kind of a break with the past. So one question, so there's the Israeli side, which you raised, and also side of Hamas. One theory that's been circulating in the press about Hamas, or various commentators, is that this was a sort of spectacular success, unexpected, a bit like 9/11. You drew that analogy. No one anticipated that the towers would really fall the way they did, that the events would unfold the way they did. And you analogized the violence that we saw to ISIS. One of the distinctions with ISIS is ISIS always showed enormous discipline over messaging, what went out to the world, very deliberate about how they presented themselves. Does not seem to be the case here, which seems consistent with the idea that this, in a sense, maybe went in a way that was not expected by Hamas. Do you agree with that?
I think that's quite possible. I think on the one hand, in terms of the infiltration, clearly that was something that Hamas had planned for a long time. But I think it's quite likely that they could not have, that they would have been surprised by how lightly guarded the Gaza border was. And the fact that they were able to overrun the Israeli military headquarters in the south and capture Israeli military bases as well as civilian communities. I think that element of it, it seems, did surprise Hamas. I mean, clearly they were planning a massive attack. They clearly, this was going to be something bigger than they had ever probably conducted before. But I do think it does indicate that maybe they were somewhat taken by surprise by their success. Their success, if you will, may turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory, because I think it may well bring devastation and destroy the organization. But so I think there's two possibilities, and I've been trying to kind of make sense of this. On the one hand, and particularly I want to focus on the nature of the violence, because I think that's important. It's not just so many militants and so many innocent civilians being killed, but the way that happened, I think, is important, because the savagery of that has basically rendered Hamas fundamentally illegitimate as an organization, as an entity to govern Gaza. And for the past, 16 years or more since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, it's sought to gain international legitimacy. It's sought to present itself as the successor to the PLO, as the representative of the Palestinians. And in this action, in a sense, it's contradicted that long-term bid for legitimacy. And so that makes me scratch my head, and I'm trying to understand, well, what can explain that? And I can think of either, one of two explanations. Either assuming if this was indeed centrally planned, as in it was also a directive to do the kind of savage violence like ISIS does, as you're absolutely right, Kal, that ISIS's savagery is scripted, it's deliberate, it's strategic. It's possible that this was true in this case, designed to provoke such a reaction among the Israelis, because it was so horrific that it would bring about the result that we're seeing today, in other words, an invasion of the Gaza Strip. So I'm a bit concerned that that it was part of Hamas's plan to provoke with such horrific violence that the Israeli government would have no choice but to invade. And that indeed may be the next stage of Hamas's plan. So that's explanation A, that this was actually was a tactical and a deliberate and a strategic choice. But there is indeed the possibility that after Hamas was able to just like walk across the border and bulldoze it over, that either its fighters or other who entered afterwards, and it wasn't just Hamas militants, there were others, may have carried out some of the worst savagery or the worst sadistic violence. So we don't know, obviously, at this point, but what is clear is that in the minds of Israelis, what Hamas had perpetrated means that for the vast majority of the Israeli public, really, I think largely there's a very broad consensus that Hamas, that the rules of the game, Hamas broke every rule of the game. And there was a kind of established, procedure, a kind of script that Israel and Hamas followed even in their previous rounds. Hamas have broken all of those rules. And so Israel is obviously taking the gloves off. And I think there's an overwhelming sentiment in Israel that Hamas needs to be completely eliminated. And that is a new and an important shift in how Israelis are approaching this.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, those of us who study war know that there are many examples in which often things are perpetrated with the goal of creating a unconscionable reaction, which we may unfortunately see in the coming weeks. If there is a ground invasion of Gaza, it's going to be incredibly bloody and difficult on both sides. Let me just ask you, and Dalia, please, if you want to weigh in on any of this, don't hesitate. I know I'm directing this to Doug, but obviously I want you to jump in if you want to add. On the Israeli side, so I'm just going to quote Shlomo Ben-Ami, the former foreign minister of Israel, in the LA Times just 2 days ago, wrote the following. He said, many have expressed surprise that Hamas so easily penetrated Israel's defenses along the border with Gaza. But there were no such defenses. When Hamas began slaughtering hundreds of defenseless civilians, Israel's glorious army was mostly deployed elsewhere. Many were assigned to the West Bank to protect religious settlers in clashes, sometimes initiated by the settlers themselves, and in festivals around their shrines, etc. So pretty serious charge to level. This doesn't even get to the question of intelligence failures. And that's an additional question that you raised. Some have said that Egypt, I think, has said that they had warned. But let's just talk about where the army was and why this was able to happen. Is that, in your view, an accurate assessment that the army was really elsewhere?
Well, I mean, certainly many units were deployed in the West Bank, not simply to protect Jewish settlers there, although certainly that is the case, but also because there's been a rising tide of violence in the West Bank, and including attacks from the West Bank into Israel. So really for the last year, that's been the focus of the IDF's attention, is trying to kind of keep down the level of violence in the West Bank, although it's been continuing to mount. But yes, I think there was both a question of the deployment of IDF units and how quickly they were able to be then moved back to the Gaza border. But in general, there was, I think, and this has been a complaint that many of the civilian communities near the Gaza border made for a few years, that they felt neglected. The experience of the last few days is, of course, totally unprecedented, but they've been living with rocket attacks for years, and the threat and the fear of infiltration. And there's been this long-standing complaint that they were relatively unprotected. And a part of that goes to, I think, the reliance on technology, the belief that somehow Israel's high-tech barrier could, keep Israel safe. And there's more broadly, and we see a similarity to like the Bar-Lev line that was built along the Suez Canal after the 1967 war, which Israelis believed would prevent the Egyptian army from crossing the canal. In the early days of 1973, the Egyptian army was able to cross the Suez Canal. The Maginot Line, in World War I. So there is this kind of belief that somehow, defensive fortifications will protect. And actually, that tends to underestimate your opponent, that actually they're able to be imaginative and to figure out sometimes. And what Hamas did in particular was very effective in the use of deception, just as Egypt and Syria did prior to the 1973 war. So I do think the IDF bears responsibility. To be fair, the IDF did actually warn repeatedly the chief of staff or tried to warn the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government that military readiness was suffering due to the domestic turmoil and the divisions and the refusal of some of Israeli reservists to serve in protest over the government's judicial overhaul. Those warnings were dismissed by the Israeli government and by on one occasion, Prime Minister Netanyahu even refused to hear from his own chief of staffs, seeing those as like politically motivated warnings. We were hearing from government ministers in Israel that these are like, leftists in the military. Well, actually, those warnings from the IDF turned out to be true. And moreover, the IDF also did say that there was the perception, of military intelligence warned the Israeli government, that there was the perception among Israel's adversaries that Israel was weak and divided, and that might have presented them with an opportunity. And I think, indeed, that does explain the timing of this attack.
Great. Dalia, do you want to weigh in on any of this so far?
Yeah, well, I think Dev did a great job in giving an overview of these horrific set of events that we've seen unfolding over the past week. And I think the key point is it's not just the quantity and the sheer numbers that have been killed. And we should also note that we have over 100 hostages, and we should discuss that, including 25 American hostages and hostages of all nationalities. So it's a global issue, not just a regional issue and crisis that we're facing. And I think the other, though, qualitative aspect, aside from the viciousness and the sadistic nature and all of the, and lots of horror details unfolding, it's also that this happened within Israel's borders, and that gets to the catastrophic failure. So you have, I think the key terms here that sum things up is you have catastrophic failure on the Israeli side and catastrophic success on Hamas's side. And that's really led to this unbelievable set of events that we've seen over this past week. And the fact that militants were able to infiltrate Israel's borders with the image of Israel as secure as any state could possibly be. No state has invested more, although Kal and I were recently in Finland and they invested quite a lot, but no state has invested more in their borders. And Netanyahu was known as Mr. Security. This was supposed to be his job, keeping Israel safe. Days into this incursion, you had Palestinian militants, Hamas militants floating around the country, terrifying Israelis. This is a sheer act of terror. On Hamas, I would just say, in terms of motivations, first of all, I think on so much of this, so many calculations were wrong, and many Israelis are acknowledging that. There's a lot we don't know, and I think that because this is such a dramatic set of events, we need to really challenge and test all of our previous assumptions on pretty much every issue. So we don't know. We do see, though, that Hamas, yes, it might have been more successful than they had anticipated, but there's no question this was months, if not years, in planning. We see very sophisticated propaganda videos coming out. They'll look a whole lot like ISIS kind of propaganda, not quite there, but they're very polished. The last thing I would say, though, in Hamas is, and it's a very important part of the story, is that there also is an internal Palestinian contestation for power. So there is a question of who is going to succeed Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. He's the leader of the Palestinian Authority. And Hamas contests his leadership. The PA really has eroding legitimacy among the Palestinians, has looked at as a failure to stand up for their rights. The PA is viewed as incredibly corrupt and ineffective in governance. So this is also, and this is extremely worrying, it could be a play for Hamas to try to take over the West Bank as well. So I think we need to have our eye on that. So I think, those would be my initial reactions. But the last thing, and I think Deb mentioned this, is that this could have been intended to really get Israel, to provoke Israel into an extreme reaction. And unfortunately and predictably, this is exactly what we're seeing. So I think it needs to be said why it is absolutely horrific loss of life and absolute massacre of Israelis that we have not yet seen in Israel's history. This is also unfolding to be a serious humanitarian crisis. We have I think at this point, the number of Palestinians killed is reached, if not surpassed, the number of Israelis. Now, many of those are, of course, militants, but we see many civilians are getting caught up in this violence. You have the kind of bombing campaign unfolding right now in Gaza that is unprecedented because it is the game changer. Israel is no longer playing by its old rules of kind of providing certain warnings that it did in the past. It's going for broke because from Israel's perspective, it has to restore deterrence and it will do whatever it takes. Of course, leaders keep asserting that they will abide by international law. And I know, I believe that President Biden is at least behind the scenes, hopefully very firmly reiterating those messages while expressing incredible solidarity with Israel, as he should. But there is the possibility for really many more civilians to die in this conflict on both sides. So we are seeing the beginning of what could be a very lengthy and bloody conflict. So as bad as this past, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but as horrible as this past week was, things can get a lot worse.
Dalia, I completely agree. And I would even go further and say, I think they almost surely will get a lot worse for all the reasons you just gave. Let me ask you in particular, Dalia, you mentioned the incredible planning, as Dov did, that went into this. Obviously, it was not an impromptu event, something that required a lot of assistance. What sort of assistance do you think Hamas got? In other words, many have speculated perhaps Iran played a role, perhaps Russia played a role, perhaps others in the region. What's your take on what is the likely story behind this in terms of who else was collaborating in some way to allow this to happen, to promote this?
Yeah, I mean, look, just like I think there's going to be commissions in Israel for many years to come to kind of unwrap what happened here, the horrible failure that left Israelis so vulnerable. I think there's going to be a lot of looking into who did it, right? And so there's a lot of controversy about this right now. I think there's a lot we don't know. A lot of people are kind of jumping out of the gate and speculating. There are things we do know. Iran certainly has been a very big backer of Hamas, and this is not a new phenomenon for many, many years since its emergence. We also know that Iran is, of course, very closely tied to other militant groups in the region, fighting Israel, particularly Hezbollah in the north, based in Lebanon. It's interesting because while we don't know for sure about its direct role in this particular catastrophic event, it is interesting that Iran is denying a direct role. It's interesting that U.S. intelligence is suggesting they do not see concrete evidence, at least not yet, of a direct Iranian role. And the Israelis, at least the IDF, has said they do not think Iran was directly involved. So whether they were or not, there's no question they provided over the years extensive training, arms, funding for Hamas. That's an undisputed fact. But there is a distinction between that and perpetrating this event. And the reason it's important is because, the Israelis themselves, all actors have a reason to see this not expand beyond the Gaza campaign, at least for now. So there's some reason to believe there'll be restraint. The Israelis are not interested in opening up a second front at this particular time, not because it would not be on their own terms. They're going to have their hands more than full in this Gaza incursion. And I think it's not much speculation at this point that there will be some kind of ground campaign. We just don't know the extent of it. It does not look like the Iranians are interested necessarily. Again, we're not sure, but it doesn't look like they'd be interested in a full out green light to Hezbollah to attack Israel, because that would then draw most likely the United States in. The United States has already moved an aircraft carrier to explicitly stated this is to deter any Hezbollah attack. Again, Americans have been killed in these events. So I think, the Iranians, I said elsewhere, they've been doing very well before this. They were mending relations in the region. They've unfortunately suppressed their domestic opposition. They were, dealing with with the United States on some kind of a de-escalation, getting some funds unfrozen, but that looks like that might be on hold now. So, it's not clear what their goal would be to really go into a full front war. They kind of like this proxy strategy where they kind of stir the pot, but they're not directly a target. So I think there's a lot of reason, and the United States is certainly not looking to start a war in the Middle East, that's for sure. And let's face it, we still have a major war in Ukraine to deal with. So I think there's room for believing that there's still an ability to contain this, as bad as it will be in Gaza. If it goes into the broader region, it's going to be really horrific, because as capable as Hamas has become, it pales in comparison to the military capabilities of Hezbollah. Hezbollah's missiles can reach all of Israel. They're getting extremely accurate. It is a very well-trained, well-funded force. We do not want to see a Hezbollah-Israeli war in the Middle East. It will not be, this is not an outcome any of us should wish for. So there's reason to believe for restraint. The reason I'm worried is for the same reason that this whole set of events unfolded. We assume certain things about Hamas that ended up not being accurate. So, is this, a lot will depend on the Israeli reaction, how the neighborhood sees the reaction. If we see a very high level of civilian casualties, total indiscriminate use of force, it's going to create more pressure on some of these groups to push the limit. So far, there have been limited attacks in the north, but there is room for miscalculation. That can lead to escalation, even if nobody would want it. It's also, the Iranians and Hezbollah may be looking at Israel as weak as Israel's ever been and as divided as it's ever been. And that could be a very tempting target, despite all these reasons for restraint. If they think that Hamas's leadership is in jeopardy, because I think that looks like what Israel's aim is to destroy Hamas. Easier said than done, but if they are able or close to doing that, if it's viewed as existential to Hezbollah or Iran, that could cross their red lines and lead to new calculations. So there's a lot of reasons to be worried that this can expand.
And I just
terrific, thank you. Dov, go ahead.
Yeah, just to pick up on that. Well, I agree with Dalia. I think there are a lot of reasons for us to be very worried. I think there's also, and Dalia alluded to a couple of reasons why I think it's less likely that Iran either directed this attack or that it will escalate. So in terms of Iranian involvement, as Dalia said, there's no question about Iran's complicity, having funded Iran from Hamas for many years, provided it with weaponry and with training. So there's no question about Iran being complicit, but responsibility, direct responsibility, is a different matter, and one that is fraught with consequences if indeed Iran was responsible. But I think there's a couple of things that indicate to me, of course, well, only time will tell, that indicate to me that Iran wasn't directly involved. Number one being, what we're hearing now is that this attack was a long time in the making, right? Not, many months. So the argument that this was somehow dictated by Iran to prevent normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the timeline doesn't add up, because that was really the intensified US diplomatic efforts and the prospect for maybe an agreement, which many analysts didn't even think was going to happen. But, that was only in the last really couple of months. Apparently, Hamas have said, according to their spokesperson, that they've been planning this for more than a year. So that's one reason to suggest that it was actually not simply directed by Iran, although I'm sure Iran gave their approval. And the other thing is, Dalia said, there's many reasons why Iran would not want at this moment in time to do this. As Dalia said, they've just got this kind of, under the table deal with the Biden administration in a way to, restrain the progress on their nuclear program, to get those free frozen funds. They're making nice with the Saudis, and there's China. There's a lot of reasons for Iran to not want to, completely turn over the table in the way that Hamas has done. So I think Iran's less likely to be directly involved. And I also think while there's very legitimate and good reason to worry about Hezbollah getting involved, I think I'm slightly less worried about that now than I was a few days ago, even though in the last few days there's actually been Hezbollah rockets fired into Israel and artillery. And the reason for that is partly because of the very decisive, forceful actions that the Biden administration have taken, as Dalia said, by deploying US naval aircraft carrier and other assets. I think that is a signal of deterrence that if Hezbollah was to enter this and open up a second front, that could actually lead to the United States taking action. And that, I think, will have sent a strong signal to Hezbollah and to the Iranians. And the other factor here is, let's also think about the situation, the domestic situation in Lebanon. And while it's true, as Dalia said, that if the civilian casualties mount in the Gaza Strip, or Hamas is on the verge of being defeated and destroyed, that might prompt Hezbollah to get involved. There's also the consideration that Hezbollah faces of people in Lebanon looking at what's happening in Gaza right now and thinking, much as we're appalled by the killing of Palestinian civilians and the destruction wrought upon Gaza, we don't want that. And so Lebanon would be, and so for Hezbollah to get involved its domestic situation is already fragile in Lebanon because of its role in Syria and in Lebanese politics. I think it would be a real risk to Hezbollah's position in Lebanon, in Lebanese politics, because it would provoke, I think, a very strong domestic backlash against Hezbollah.
Yeah, and Kal, if I could just add, I agree with that. I think that is a restraining factor. It would not be popular among the population in Lebanon, but I don't want to make this sound too good news, because I think we're in a very grim period and very dangerous period. And even the US-Iran understanding seem to be unraveling. So I think anything's possible. We really need, I think, to have some humility here about that. But there is, I think, another difference between kind of wars of the past, which is the broader neighborhood is not interested in this expanding. Right? They have their domestic agenda. So Egypt is its own, it's not interested in a major refugee, definitely has most at stake because it's bordering Gaza and does not want a massive refugee flow into the country. They're also worried from a security perspective about Hamas. They are a Muslim Brotherhood organization, and Sisi was basically at war with the Muslim Brotherhood and dismantled them in Egypt. So they're not looking for that. They have militants, extremists in the Sinai, Sunni kind of extremist groups that they're already dealing with. And then you have Gulf states who have domestic agendas, Saudi's 2030 vision. The UAE is hosting the COP, the big climate conference next month in Dubai. The last thing they want is a full-scale Middle East war in the Middle East, a wide regional war that's going to disrupt those kinds of domestic agendas. So the region, the Qataris even, they're all really trying to work the phones, back channel diplomacy to try to keep things calm, not escalate. And just getting back to the hostages, this is where I think that America's regional partners, we put a lot into our investment into those partners, and there's lots of controversy about what we're getting back. Now is the time to be getting a return on that investment, because a lot of these players have very important links to Hamas. Especially the Qataris, the Egyptians have often in the past found ways to get ceasefires between Hamas and Israel. They have communication channels. If they can, at the very least, help with alleviating this hostage crisis. We've never seen a hostage situation of this magnitude between Israelis and Palestinians for that many. And again, it's of many nationalities. So that is, I think, I wouldn't say a reassuring factor, but at least not a destabilizing factor that the Middle East at large wants us to expand. No, they want to calm this down. They want to keep this as contained as possible and hopefully stop the violence and the conflict in Gaza as soon as is feasible. That's going to be harder because of the way the Israelis look like they will be responding to this because of the magnitude. So that is the bind. But in terms of the wider region, there are reasons for thinking there could be some restraint to be determined, though.
Thank you, Dalia. Just to the audience, we will be going to audience questions in a little bit. I just want to talk about, first of all, the United States specifically. So we've covered a lot of the region. We mentioned the US a few times. Obviously, the U.S. has a long-standing, very strong tie to Israel, but as Dalia mentioned, many, many initiatives in the region generally. So, can we expect, what can we expect of the United States? So yes, deterrence, we're already doing that. We have a carrier strike group in the region, maybe a second one headed that way. So that's obviously aimed at deterrence, but what else? What else is realistic for the US to aspire to? We've seen American presidents for decades attempt to play a peaceful role in the region. That is sort of the brass ring for an American president to do something meaningful. It has eluded almost everyone, really everyone in the long term. Is that possible here? And what should the US be doing? So that's really to either of you, both of you.
In terms of well, I think first of all, the Biden administration's reaction thus far has been very good in terms of particularly President Biden's speech. The expression which was heartfelt, and it was clearly heartfelt, and I think that really had a really important impact upon Israelis to hear those words from an American president, and to have that expression of concern, and Secretary of State Blinken's repeated that. And that's important, not just on the symbolic level. It's not just about a declarative, or rhetorical expression of support for Israel. One part of that is also because it then gives the Biden administration the ability to, I think, hopefully counsel Israel quietly behind the scenes for a more restrained military approach in Gaza. In other words, what they're doing, which I think is quite smart, is to very publicly, unequivocally back Israel publicly, and to make it clear that the United States absolutely recognizes Hamas's attack for what it was, as an act of, President Biden called it, unadulterated evil, while at the same time emphasizing the importance that while Israel's reaction may be justified, it still has to be legal. It has to observe the laws of war, and to try to caution Israel in this moment to not act out of just a desire for kind of revenge, or to just decimate the Gaza Strip, but to be as targeted as possible and to minimize civilian casualties. And I think that's really important to be making that point, because partly it's not just a humanitarian issue. First and foremost, it's a moral and humanitarian issue to try to protect the lives of as many innocent civilians in Gaza as possible. But it's also strategic, because if Israel just pulverizes the Gaza Strip and continues and does what it's saying it's going to do, very, very quickly it's going to lose any kind of international support for its actions and sympathy. And there's going to be an intense pressure on the US government and on the Biden administration from some Democrats in Congress and from US allies around the world to bring the conflict to an end, to initiate a ceasefire. So if Israel is indeed intent on striking at Hamas, it has to, for its own reasons, do it in a very, I think, more deliberate manner than it is doing, and that it's saying, because actually it will completely lose international support and will be quite quickly pressured toward a ceasefire if its response is unrestrained. So that's important. And the third thing, of course, is also just the military resupply of interceptors for Israel's Iron Dome missile system and ammunition. The United States, I think anybody who questioned the value of the US-Israel alliance, or why it's important for the United States to have this relationship with Israel, this is clear over the last few days. It's clear to Israelis how important US support for Israel is, despite some of the statements that have come out of the Israeli government over the past year. We see that at this time, it's really important. And I think it's also really important that the United States, by standing by Israel, is hopefully able to counsel Israel that while its reaction, its desire for revenge is entirely understandable, and its military response is justified, it needs to be smart about it. And revenge isn't a strategy. And its military response has to be in accordance with the international law, and also ultimately has to serve strategic interests. And so hopefully Secretary of State Blinken is delivering that message as I speak now in his meetings with Israeli officials.
Completely agree, Dov. And I'll just note internally, this isn't a discussion about the US government or American politics, but obviously this war is already dividing the Democratic Party, as issues around Israel have divided Democrats, to some degree Republicans, but especially Democrats for some time. And that will obviously continue accelerated if the most aggressive intervention occurs, as we're sort of discussing. Dalia.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with all of that. I do think, though, in addition to the overt support for Israel, that's very clear, and Blinken, Secretary Blinken, right, this trip is reinforcing the president's statements and material support we're giving, and kind of the back channel messaging about restraint, which will be, for all the reasons Deb mentioned, very important. I think, though, the U.S. is going to have to think about more concrete moves openly when it comes to humanitarian assistance, because it's going to get very bloody and very horrific, and civilians are going to be suffering. And so I think here is where the U.S. should be working with the International Red Cross, with other international allies. We have to think, I think this idea of humanitarian corridors is extremely problematic if it's kind of read as, kind of forcing Palestinians out of Gaza in a way that they won't be able to return. But we should start, thinking about whether there are safe havens, humanitarian supplies to get into Gaza at some point. So I think the United States is going to have to think more carefully on the humanitarian front, what we can concretely do, and that's short term. And then in longer term, I think we're going to have to be much more serious about the Palestinian-Israeli peace track. I mean, this idea, I think a lot of folks probably may know, I've been quite skeptical of the push on the Israeli-Saudi front, not because I'm opposed to normalization. I think the Israelis and Saudis are going to move toward each other for their own reasons, even despite this, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I think the U.S. was pushing too hard. It wasn't clear what we were going to get out of it. And honestly, the Palestinian part, the idea that we'd leverage it to get something big on the Palestinian track, was looked at as a joke. This idea, the term being used was, let's push for a significant Palestinian component or something along those lines. We have to put those terms in the waste bin. I mean, that's not enough anymore. We have to have, and there's no easy solution, but it needs to be a serious, concerted effort, not alone, can be with partners, but we need to come up with an alternative. As Dev said, revenge isn't a strategy. Getting rid of your enemy isn't a strategy if you don't have an alternative. What is the alternative? What is the vision for the future? Netanyahu pushed a strategy for many years that basically opposed a two-state solution. He supported the continuation of Hamas in Gaza, greenlit cash coming through to the organization from Doha, because he did not want a unified Palestinian state. That is no longer feasible. And the United States can't just be supporting this kind of Band-Aid, containment, mow the lawn kind of strategy. It's not going to work. So we need to be supporting actors in the region, the Palestinians themselves, international partners, those who want peace and stability in this region. We have to do something that's more serious and more long-term and viable. So we need the short term, but we also have to be thinking toward a longer term strategy. And a normalization strategy is not it. That is not enough. It's fine on its own, but that is not a replacement for Israeli-Palestinian peace, because there's never going to be stability in this region without resolving the core of this conflict.
I completely agree with Dalia. I think this was a failure not just for Israeli strategy and Israeli policy, but American policy over successive administrations. The Biden administration prioritizing a deal with Saudi Arabia and really just trying to keep the conflict on the low boil and on a low burn was obviously a mistake. The Trump administration, the whole belief that somehow you could kind of neglect or ignore the Palestinian issue and focus on building Israel's relations with the Arab states or on the confrontation with Iran has been proven to be a serious mistake. And I absolutely agree with Dalia. I think now there needs to be a renewed focus on trying to actually, even resolve the conflict, or at least to recognize that maintaining a blockade, allowing Israel to maintain a 16-year-long blockade of Gaza is not sustainable, and to only pay attention to the suffering of Gazans when there's a war taking place is not sustainable. And that you need to address this issue, because as the United States, US decision makers have learned time and again, but never seem to internalize it, if you ignore this issue, it will come back to haunt you. It will destabilize your other priorities and goals. So you cannot afford to neglect this issue. It's still there. And I do think it's going to require now, once this war is ended, that it will require really invigorated US diplomacy toward hopefully reconciling the Palestinians and ensuring that there's a single Palestinian government, and then moving from that to ending the blockade of Gaza and trying to then actually restart some kind of real negotiations. That won't happen with this Israeli government. But one thing we haven't talked about yet is that this Israeli government isn't going to be around for too long, because I think, apart from anything else, it has proven itself to be, catastrophically inept.
Great. Okay. So to those watching and listening, we were scheduled for an hour. This is such a good discussion. And with Dov and Dalia's agreement, Dalia's in Sweden. It's quite late, but we're going to run over by 15 minutes. Is that okay? I think we have a lot of questions from the audience. In fact, over 50 questions. So I apologize to those of you sending in questions. Obviously, we cannot get to all your questions. If we had 10 hours, we probably couldn't get to all the questions that are raised here, but we will get to many of them. And there's so many issues. So maybe we'll start where Dov just left off. There's a number of questions about this current government, and obviously in Israel. Obviously, there's many, many issues about that. One of the questions that came in is the following. How can the failed leadership in Israel remain in power? When Chamberlain's policy in Britain failed at the start of World War II, Churchill took over. How can Netanyahu continue? It sounds like the answer that Dov is giving is he's not going to continue. But I'm curious to hear from both of you what you think will happen, and what kind of government might actually emerge.
To be clear, I don't think Netanyahu is going to do the right thing and resign. I mean, this is a prime minister who is already on trial and didn't resign over that. So I don't expect Netanyahu. I think what I was suggesting is that I do think his legacy, his reputation will be forever tarnished. This will be an indelible stain on his legacy, such as it is. And we thought the judicial overhaul, judicial coup, would be the coup de grace, so to speak, for his legacy. This is, he can no longer claim to be Mr. Security. But let's be clear, he still needs to hold on to power for as long as possible, because that's his best shot at staying out of jail. So I don't think Netanyahu is going to leave. This is the reason why he was being, in this moment, unwilling to ditch his far-right coalition partners, as Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, wanted as a condition for his party's entry into the government. So I don't think the government's going to collapse anytime soon, because they have to stay. They know that when there will be elections, they will lose those elections. So I think he will cling on to power for as long as possible. But yes, I think, for all of the many failings of this government over the last year, first and foremost, obviously, in terms of pushing through such a controversial judicial reform package, which, as we now know, I think probably put Israel in a position where it seemed so weak and vulnerable that it provoked this attack. But I think the emergency government that's been formed for the duration of the war, it's not unity, it's an emergency government, it's just a wartime government, is at least something. At least there's some kind of responsible adults in the room. Having Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, I think, is a good thing. It will hopefully dilute the influence of the far-right extremists in the government who just want to flatten Gaza and expel its population. And I think there's a real, I would be very worried if Benny Gantz, for example, wasn't in that central decision-making. So I'm pleased that government is formed, because it's important for Israel's, for the legitimacy, especially if, as is likely, this is going to be a long and very bloody war, and there's going to be large numbers of Israeli military casualties. For the government to sustain domestic support and unity, it's essential that it had this slightly broader composition in this emergency government. But in time, I think absolutely Netanyahu, the government's days are numbered, and certainly Netanyahu's political legacy and his reputation is going to be sundered by this permanently.
Let me just add to the questioner's question. What is the appropriate role of the U.S. in that process? So, the U.S. government obviously is, as you pointed out earlier, Dov, a huge supporter of Israel at a crucial time. We've heard a lot of rhetoric out of the current government, or prior, the non-unity government, often very critical of the United States and its alleged meddling, when, clearly our government is deeply involved. Should we be involved in some way in pushing Israel? So I'll just give an example. Tom Friedman, longtime commentator on the Middle East, sometimes people like to mock, but someone who continues to be widely read. He wrote the following in the New York Times: America cannot protect Israel in the long run from the very real threats it faces unless Israel has a government that reflects the best, not the worst of its society. And unless that government's ready to forge compromises with the best, not the worst of Palestinian society. Probably true. So should the US behind the scenes be nudging things, or is that sort of out of bounds?
I think it's tried to do that already. You know, it was not, it's worth noting that President Biden met with Benny Gantz in Washington before he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I think, you know, they've been hoping to bring in a national unit, Gantz's party, and even Lapid's, in order to strike a deal with Saudi Arabia. The problem is the United States is generally does a bad job of getting involved in domestic politics, in other countries' domestic politics, and it often backfires. I think there's enough outrage among Israelis right now over this government's failings that you don't need the United States to be pointing out how inept and extremist this government is. Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis know it. I think their decision will be rendered at the ballot box. And I think actually the United States getting involved might actually backfire and cause a kind of keep out of our business reaction. So I think the United States should focus on areas where it's likely to be most effective in terms of Israeli decision-making about the war and its policy towards Hamas. Is Israel trying to remove Hamas from power, or is it trying to deliver a punishing blow against Hamas and leave it in power? We don't yet know what the war aim is because it seemed to shift it somewhat. That's where I think right now the United States can really have an important role behind the scenes. I think getting involved in Israeli domestic politics is fraught with risk for the US administration.
Great. Okay, next question, I think a very useful question. What sources, scholars, journalists, activists, are you, both of you, reading, watching for both the Israeli and the Palestinian points of view? So who do you recommend? What sort of things should everyone tuning into this is obviously very interested in what we're talking about. I think this has been a terrific session, but this session will end soon. So where else should they go? Dalia, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think Dev is better person on references, but you know, it's hard to just give a long list, but I think a key thing is to read regional sources, not just Western. So even if you just read the English versions of them, you know, a paper like Haaretz, or, you know, has a very good English language, good analysis on a regular basis, you know, for broader Arab world, Al Arabiya has, you'll get kind of, you know, they have angles, but you kind of know. Palestinian commentators are very important. I don't want to single out names because that starts getting very polarizing, but I think the key thing, rule of thumb, is to diversify your sources. So make sure you're pulling on a variety of viewpoints, not just one viewpoint. And the other thing I would caution is don't just retweet or whatever social media you use these days. You know, don't just recirculate unverified videos, state reports as if they're facts. I mean, this just came up yesterday when, you know, there were kind of reports of a possible Hezbollah invasion or attack on Israel that turned out to be false, and people started circulating as if it was real. I just talked to a colleague whose family's in Beirut. They were terrified, and Israelis were terrified. You know, everybody was kind of bracing for the worst. And you know, this has real consequence. This isn't just us comfortable, you know, sitting in California or in Sweden. You know, there's a lot at stake. So I think also it's a good time to be very much aware and cautious about what you're circulating and how you're circulating it. Emotions, tensions are very high, rightly so. This is a very raw moment. So I think I want to get that point out more than anything.
Sound advice. Doug?
Yeah, I would say I think I completely agree with Dalia about the importance of having multiple sources. And also to, you know, not jump to conclusions until there's verification, because there's all sorts of misinformation and even disinformation circulating right now, particularly on social media. So I do think it's important that people kind of, take a breath before retweeting something or before assuming something, because it's very fast moving. Even the governments involved, don't really necessarily know what's happening at all times. So we need to be careful. And I think, as an analyst, I think we should also recognize that there's a certain degree of humility here, because this is, as it was in the aftermath of 9/11, where many were like, what did we miss? What did we get wrong? Right. So there are lots of experts and analysts. I can name a number of good books or articles that have been written on Hamas. I'm not sure how good they are anymore, because they all seem to make the case that Hamas was moderating over time. It was becoming a kind of government of Gaza, and it was shifting from its more early radical roots. And that wisdom, which was the collective wisdom about Hamas, has, I think, been challenged, to say the least. I will just put a plug in for my center, because one of the things we're going to be doing in today or tomorrow is we're going to be posting a list of resources, educational resources, on our website. So we're suggesting, now we don't, the views expressed in them aren't the views of our center, but we are going to try to provide some sources and recommendations, and we're also going to continue to put out more events in the days and weeks to come, to try to keep everybody informed. So multiple sources are important. Trusted sources are important as well. You don't all need to become Middle East experts overnight, or experts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Otherwise, it's an overwhelming task, and sometimes actually all the noise can actually obscure the picture. So I think it's sometimes, if it's, just as in the last few days, we've heard so much commentary and analysis, sometimes we have obscured the horror that took place over the weekend in Israel. So actually, don't get too caught up in the weeds, I would say, because that actually can miss the big picture of the unfolding war and the humanitarian crisis that is also taking place right now. Agreed.
Okay, next question. Are there any links between the Wagner Group or Russian involvement, or perhaps other proxies for Iran? This certainly has turned U.S. attention away from Ukraine. And the questioner points to the execution of the attacks was sophisticated, with drones, paragliders, cyber attacks, etc. I didn't know about cyber attacks, but I'm going to assume that's true. So that's more maybe Dalia's bailiwick, but either of you, what do you think about that? I've not heard anything about the Wagner Group, but what about Russia? I have heard that speculated about, and there's no question on the kind of who benefits analysis that you could argue Russia has gained. So any thoughts?
Well, I think, Kal, you just answered it really. This is I think there's no evidence of Russian. I mean, the Russians are busy enough with some bad news stuff in other theaters. They don't need to expand to this one. But there's no question this does benefit them. It takes the attention off of Ukraine. The U.S. is diverting resources back to the Middle East when it said it was going to, refocus, let alone, Middle East, it was going to focus on China and of course Ukraine. So there is worry already. There was concern about diminishing U.S. support for Ukraine, especially among Republican Party, but even some in the Democratic Party. So this is going to raise questions about the bandwidth of the United States to be supporting both of these. And when it comes to choosing between the two, you're going to get a lot more bipartisan support for supporting Israel than for Ukraine in today's domestic system as it is in the US. So I think from that perspective, I can see Russia kind of probably not fretting too much that this is happening, but I think it's a bridge too far to accuse them of meddling. Certainly their alignment with Iran has grown significantly. They've almost become more dependent on Iran because of the drone transfers in the Ukraine war. But again, we have no evidence yet of a specific role, so I don't think we should exaggerate that without evidence.
Great.
And I would just add, I don't think, we should infer from actors that benefit that they were therefore involved, and that's often a kind of a fallacy that people, because so and so benefited, therefore they had a role. I think the likelihood is that this was Hamas. Hamas decided to. They were planning this. They've had support over the years from various, I think most Iran. I'm sure Russia might benefit. I think we have to be. The conspiracy theories will start to proliferate. We live in an age of conspiracism. And that starts to muddy the waters. So right now we have to focus on what we know. And what we know is that Hamas carried out that attack. While other countries may benefit, Russia may benefit, I don't think we should assume that infer because they benefited, therefore they actually had a role somehow in the planning or knew in advance that it would take place.
Totally agree with that. Okay, so next question. This is a difficult one. What should Israel's goal be? Do you think occupying Gaza is the only answer? And I'll just note that Israel had occupied Gaza and had withdrawn in a very, very contentious process. Some, I don't know, 13 years ago, 15, I can't remember how many years ago at this point, 18 years ago. Very contentious withdrawal. And the Israeli position has long been that they are not the occupying power of Gaza. That's not, I would say, universally accepted outside the region. Many people consider Israel to still be, in a sense, occupying, but as a practical matter, Israel has been out. So the question is both what's the goal should be, and is occupation maybe a realistic and appropriate goal?
Well, that's the million-dollar question right now. I wrestle with it myself. I would frame it in this way. Israel may be justified in toppling Hamas's regime in the sense that Hamas, I think, deserves no longer, if it ever did deserve to rule Gaza, but whether it should do so is another question entirely. And I think much as there is an understandable desire among Israelis and many people around the world to say Hamas have proven themselves through their actions to have no right to govern Gaza and should be eliminated. Whether it's wise to try and do that is another question. And I think, unfortunately, while regime change may be justified, I don't think it's actually going to be feasible in this instance. I think there's many good reasons why Israel previously avoided a major invasion of the Gaza Strip in an attempt. Nobody was under illusions about Hamas, but they recognized that occupying Gaza would be fraught with danger. It would, I fear, turn into a kind of quagmire. I mean, the analogy, going back to the point I made at the beginning of my remarks about 9/11, the analogy, I think, is an apt one. The United States had good reason to go after al-Qaeda after 9/11 and even to depose the Taliban, which sheltered al-Qaeda. But what happened as a result of that was a long and bloody occupation and quagmire in Afghanistan, which took decades before the United States could get out. And what happened? The Taliban are back. And so I think, unfortunately, there is no, and this is a very hard thing for people, I think, to hear right now, where there is a strong and understandable desire to hit back and hurt Hamas. There isn't a military solution to this. There isn't a military solution to this. While Hamas deserves to be defeated, and I would shed no tears over the elimination of its leadership and its militants and its stock, the question is it smart for Israel now to try to eliminate Hamas? What would be in its place? What would happen the day after? I'm not sure the Palestinian Authority. The best case scenario would be, yes, you can get rid of Hamas and install the Palestinian Authority. That's the ideal scenario. But I think, these kind of rosy predictions, again, the United States learned before the invasion of Iraq, rosy predictions about regime change rarely come to pass. It's a path fraught with danger. So I think Israel has to be very smart and think through this. And I'm not sure in this moment that that's happening. I feel like there's much more of this desire to decimate Hamas and not necessarily thinking about, well, what happens the next day.
Well put. Dalia, do you want to add anything to that?
No, just very shortly, we're running out of time. I would just say the day after is critical, but it's also not hypothetical, not just in terms of the US example, but the Israeli example, right? Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, and it didn't withdraw from Lebanon until the year 2000. So Israel knows what quagmires are. There's a reason it has not invaded Gaza, despite knowing Hamas was an extremely serious threat. So it's easier said than done. That said, there probably is some ground. I can't see Israel just returning to the status quo, given the magnitude of this. But I also think it's unrealistic to say it's going to completely wipe Hamas out. That's going to be very hard, but they can diminish them, just like the US diminished ISIS. We haven't gotten rid of ISIS, but you can marginalize them. But again, you need an alternative to do that, right? You need something else that's viable. So, and the other thing I would say, and I don't know what Israel should do, I'm not one to advise them on this, but we also might see outcomes unfolding that are kind of short of full occupation, but also not status quo. Like, for example, what happened in southern Lebanon, where Israel occupied a sliver of southern Lebanon for many, many years. And so I forgot what we called it at this point. I wrote an article about it. I should remember, but there was like what they called the security zone or safety zone or whatever the word was. So we might see things like that where they just focus on blocking that border, so that we don't know, but there's other outcomes that are possible.
Great. Okay, so I think we're out of time. I think that's an excellent place to end. There's so much more to be said. I want to flag what Dov said a moment ago. The Nazarian Center, of course, will continue to do more on this topic. The Burkle Center, I can't say what else we'll do, but we will certainly be doing more on this as well. There's so much here, and it's going to have reverberations, I think, for years, if not decades. This might be one of those true pivot points in the Middle East's history that has implications really for the entire world. So a terrible, terrible series of events, but a very good conversation today about them. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the audience. And we are unfortunately at the end. So I'm going to bid you farewell. And again, stay tuned for more, certainly from the Nazarian Center and from others at UCLA. Thanks, everyone.